My name is Eliot Cohen. I'm the Dean of Johns Hopkins SAIS, and it's with great pleasure that I welcome back my friend and colleague, Anne Applebaum. Anne is a professor at SAIS. She's also a senior fellow at the Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins. She's based really on three continents, two continents and an island. Poland, the United States, and the UK. She is an extraordinary author. She won the Pulitzer Prize in 2004 for her history of the Gulag, and she's written on both the famine in the Ukraine and Iron Curtain, the crushing of Eastern Europe. So none of the books are really too cheerful, but they are all wonderful. I can vouch for that. She is of course, publishes regularly in The Atlantic, New York Review of Books. She was the deputy editor of The Spectator. When people use the term public intellectual, I think first and foremost of Anne. And what we're going to be doing today is discussing her latest book, Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism. So a somewhat foreboding topic. One thing I want to do is ask any of you who have questions, please use the Q&A function. So if you're a student, please identify yourself as such. In general, you should identify who you are in the Q&A, and I will be privileging students as I always do on these occasions. So with that, Anne, welcome back. It's good to see you. And let me begin by just asking you to describe the quite poignant opening scene in the book. Many of you may have read actually a version of it in The Atlantic, and it's about a house party. So let's start with that, Anne.
So thank you. First of all, thank you. I'm delighted to be here spiritually or virtually or however it is that I'm there at SAIS, even though I'm in fact at this exact second in Germany. But I'm with you emotionally or something, or cyberly or in some way. So yes, the book does begin with a party, and this is not because I'm a great hostess or because I give really good parties or anything like that, or even because I give that many parties, but because the party is a useful metaphor for a kind of group of friends and acquaintances who, at the time I gave the party, which is in 1999, it was the Millennium Party. It was a New Year's Eve party on December the 31st, 1999. And at the time I gave the party, it was a group of people who all felt like they were on the same side. And there were a few British friends there, and there were a few Americans, but most of the people there were Poles. And they were, at that time, my husband was a junior minister in the Polish government, and he was the junior foreign minister. And the Poles were other junior figures, young journalists, people somehow affiliated with the anti-communist center-right, is how I would describe them. And the mood at that time among that group of people was hugely optimistic. And, and everyone in the room would have shared a kind of sense that things were going well, that Poland had overthrown communism, that it was now on the road to integrating with the West, that Poland was going to be a powerful democracy, and it was going to it was going to join the world, and it was going to kind of join the group of nations that it had come from, and that it would and that things would sort of go on getting better. Many things happened that night, and I joke about them a little in the beginning of the book. There was one particularly nutty guest who took out a blank pistol and shot it at the ceiling, for example. And there was, I think, beef stew served, made with my mother-in-law mostly. I mean, it wasn't an especially elegant party. On that same night, and we did not appreciate at the time how ominous this was, Boris Yeltsin resigned. He resigned that evening. And named Vladimir Putin as his successor. But essentially we all felt, this was a group of people who felt like they were all together. When I reflected back on that party 10 years later, 20 years later actually, I realized that that group of people had divided, and that some of the people who were there no longer spoke to the other people who were there, and these were not personal problems. It was a very deep political division had grown up on what used to be the center-right in Poland, on the sort of anti-communist, anti-communist center, really. And that Poland had now, diverged very sharply and had become a country of two very bitter and tribes. And then I began to think about other people that I knew in other countries, whether it was the UK, where I worked for a long time in the 1990s as a journalist, again, on the Spectator magazine as the kind of center right. And of course, there has also been a deep division between the Brexiteers and the anti-Brexiteers. And then naturally, I thought of the Republican Party in the United States, which is also divided very bitterly as well. And so I thought, there's a story here. And the book is an attempt to explain that division. It doesn't give you one single answer. Like, I don't have a formula that explains it, and I don't have a explanation that works for every single person. And I don't claim that whatever happened in Poland was exactly the same as whatever happened in England or the United States. I just picked out some patterns that you can see in those three countries. I also threw in some other things, some reporting in Spain and Greece. And I also looked back over other moments in history when there had been these kinds of splits, when people who thought they were on the same side and more or less shared the same views suddenly discovered that they had completely opposite views. And the most famous example of this is the Dreyfus trial in France. The end of the 19th and early 20th centuries, which was explained in the book, was another moment when people suddenly found themselves on very opposite sides of a political issue, who had been at the same parties together only, a few years before. And the book goes through some of the explanations and some of the people involved, and looks at what some of those patterns have been, and tries to trace something that I feel I was a witness to, and not that I always understood it at the time, but I understood in retrospect, which was the radicalization of a part of what used to be the center right in Western democracies, and that's essentially the theme of the book.
When we first talked in the early stages when you were writing the book, I was thinking, well, there is a large genre of, in fact, I think Norman Podhoretz wrote a book on the subject of, friends I've broken with.
His book is about ex-friends, is what he said.
Ex-friends, but this really this is very different, because it is a diagnosis of something that many of us experience. I mean, I know personally I've experienced. There are people who I wouldn't consider very close friends, but I would have identified them as such, who now, I mean, it's not just that we don't talk, it's I don't understand. I literally don't understand what was going on. And so I think this is it's triggered by that break, but it is something a lot deeper. I think part of the argument is one which actually goes to the particular role of intellectuals. I mean, you talk about politicians, you're married to a politician, but a lot of this is about intellectuals. And I thought, if I might, I just want to read a few sentences from pretty early in the book, where you say, if it happens, the fall of liberal democracy in our own time will not look as it did in the 1920s or 1930s, but it will require a new elite, a new generation of clerics, and you'll explain what that word is a reference to bring it about. The collapse of an idea of the West, or of what is sometimes called the Western liberal order, will need thinkers, intellectuals, journalists, bloggers, writers, and artists to undermine our current values, and then to imagine the new system to come. They may come from different places, ideologues of the right as well as the left. Both are still with us. Could you expand a bit on that? You're referencing there, of course, a book that was very famous in the interwar period, a book that's usually translated as The Treason of the Intellectuals by Julien Benda. But could you expand on that a little bit? And is that what you think you are seeing now?
Yeah, so Julien Benda's book is called The Treason of the Intellectuals, or La Trahison des Clercs, sometimes the treason of the clerks or clerks. And the word that he uses a word that has a connotation of clerical, priests, or and it doesn't translate exactly as intellectual, which is why I use the word a little bit in the book. And what he means is intellectuals who have abandoned any idea of neutrality, of a search for truth, of some separateness, and who have instead become beholden to who have become partisan, essentially, and have begun to use their prodigious talents of being able to read and write and speak, and they have begun to put them in the service of a political movement. And the reason his book is famous, actually, is because he does speak in that book, which is published in the 1920s, he does speak in that book about intellectuals. He talks about the far right and the far left. I mean, he's actually mostly upset about fascists, but he talks about the extreme left as well, by which at that time he meant Soviet communism. And the reason it's famous is there's a sentence in the book in which he says, "And I predict that the clash between these two groups will lead to a catastrophe in which millions of people will die." And that is what happened a decade and a half later. And so the book was read after the war, in particular, as a kind of, as having being a prognostication, somebody who saw the future and predicted it. And that was part of why it retained some fame. It was a book that it was one of the books that I reread when I was trying to understand what had happened to my friends, what was changing. And it did have a lot of resonance, because you can see, and I sketch some portraits of people in the book, you can see how the temptation of politics for very clever people is very strong. And the temptation to work on behalf of one-sided politics, to join an avant-garde or outsider political movement, and to then therefore become one of the leaders of it, and to become one of the people who imagines it and creates it and does the propaganda for it, and to then be carried along by it, is a very heady and exciting experience. I mean, it's a heady and exciting experience for anybody. To be swept up in politics. And that, I think Benda's insight was in the, in his explanation of why in particular these extreme movements had attracted clever people. He saw it as part of it was part of a way for them to gain power, to have influence, to have access, to have a bigger role than maybe they had when they were university professors or authors of novels. And in his book, he names various people who he sees doing this, and it doesn't matter who they are, but they were well-known French intellectuals at the time. And so I thought, well, is there a similar phenomenon happening now? And the answer is yes. I mean, you can find in a lot of countries, you can find people who've been seduced by extremism. And who then put their talents to its use, and so that was what that passage was an allusion to.
Yeah, I think you also reference another one of the favorite books we share, Czeslaw Milosz's *The Captive Mind*, which is about intellectuals basically signing up with the Communist Party, even if they don't entirely believe it, but they kind of go along. But I guess here's the question for you. Because the interwar period and the immediate post-World War II period loom over the book, and of course they've featured so powerfully in your writing, particularly your book writing. The thing I find baffling here is, on the whole, the alternative is a mess. I mean, it's incoherent, particularly in the United States. Now, you might say less so in some of the other countries that you write about, Poland, Hungary, even Britain in a certain way. But, you could say that in the 20s and 30s, there was something, although there were obviously plenty of things that were sinister, there was also a lot that was fresh and compelling and even exciting about both fascism and communism, right? And there were, and you had liberal democracies which looked deeply problematic in a variety of ways, and of course they were feeding off that. But where is the exciting, compelling germ of all this that you think brings people into it? Or is it just a mood of despair, which you also write about?
I mean, so you sort of seem to, I mean, the fact that you and I don't see what's exciting and compelling about it is maybe reflective of who we are and what our values are. But believe me, for many people, Trumpism is very exciting and compelling, you know, so. So I, you know, I would be cautious with this, but I think, but let me start where you ended actually, which is that I think the prerequisite for anybody to find a radical movement exciting has to be deep despair and pessimism about the society that you live in. I mean, it's when you have concluded that all other avenues of politics don't work. You know, when you think that your society is degenerate or falling apart or can't be fixed or is going downhill or is somehow, you know, losing its position in the world or its status, or when, you know, there's a, and this is why these things sometimes follow economic crises, although I think they're usually more psychological than economic. It's that kind of really deep despair that leads people into radicalism. Because if it's true that, you know, as my friend, the late Roger Scruton wrote, and I quote him in the book, you know, that England is dead, you know, that it's finished and that the society that I grew up in is over. Well, then why wouldn't you want something radically different? Because then the only solution is is a revolution or a change in which everything is replaced and everything is different, because there's nothing to retrieve or save anyway. And this is a sentiment that recurs over and over and over again in countries that are rapidly modernizing. And I write about it in 19th century Germany, and actually it's a part of what happens in France and the US and elsewhere. You know, this very often the speed of change brings on this despair. You know, something from the past has been lost. You know, the traditional way of life or things I remember from my childhood are gone. You know, they're dead now. And this, for some people, creates a feeling of pessimism.
Yeah, on your suggestion, I read the Roger Scruton book, and it's very sad. It's very poignant. Yes. And of course, he was not an extremist in any way.
No, not at all. And he's, I didn't count him as one, but he's an important person who expresses this idea.
Yeah. But I guess, and again, I just want to remind people, use the Q&A function. Just make sure whatever you say, there's a question mark at the end of it, okay? We're getting lots of notes of admiration, which I'll share with you later. But at the moment, we're going to want questions. Okay, so what is it exactly about modernity right now that is, in that case, driving so many people crazy?
So I think, you know, there are a lot of elements to it. Again, the speed of change is part of it. Remember how fast, social change is happening in our country. I mean, things that seemed impossible 20 years ago are normal now. But the one element of it that I pick out and focus on in the book, because I'm really convinced that it's quite central to all of this, is the change in the information sphere. It's just simply the case that the way we get and process political information and also information about our societies, about the world that we live in, now comes from the internet. And I don't only mean social media, although that's an important piece of it, but our understanding of the world is now partly based in the virtual world. And I think that's had a really revolutionary effect on politics and on the way that we talk about politics and think about it in all kinds of ways. And I sort of enumerate some of them in the book. And, you know, one of the most famous ways is that it's made possible this very deep and rapid polarization. So people living in echo chambers and people being reinforced constantly in whichever of the right or left narratives that they believe in, and having that constantly built and reinforced by whatever, your aunt on Facebook or your cousin on Reddit or the redstate.com and Fox News on the one hand, or MSNBC and something, the Jacobin on the other hand. So, and people are reinforced constantly in their views, and very deep polarization also has a side effect, which is that it leads people to be distrustful of institutions. Because if you think, and this we can see, this is playing out in real time in our election, but if you think that, the other side has captured, institutions of this central institution of democracy, and that therefore they are no longer legitimate, you will lose faith in them. And this is something that can happen on both sides of the political spectrum. The polarization winds up undermining faith in institutions, faith in the system, faith in democracy, faith in the leaders that it chooses. It's a very, very negative. And the degree to which the changes in media, and also I should add changes in broadcast media as well, have created and emphasized polarization, I think is a big and central piece of the problem.
Yeah. Just a couple more questions, then I'm open it up. So, the three countries that you care about most, Poland, UK, United States, on a spectrum, if we're thinking about, what do you think the chances are that they're going to, these constitutional orders, these societies will weather the storm? I'll tell you what, I'll give you a 1 to 5 spectrum, where 1 is, it's like the seasonal flu, in rare cases, it's really dangerous, but 3 is it's coronavirus. You may be able to get through it, or you may end up being intubated, and God knows where that leads. And 5, it's the Black Death. So that's your spectrum. How would you assess each of those 3 countries?
So I'm going to annoy you by saying I put them all in the coronavirus because.
Oh, that's an evasion.
No, because in each, we could go into great detail about Polish politics if you want, and I can tell you what's positive and negative about it. I've actually spent the day talking about it, but really, I don't think of history as being deterministic at all. I think at any given moment, it's totally open. And a huge range of possibilities are still open to us. And so, in the US, we have everything is on the table right now, from, a Biden landslide and the Democrats win the Senate by, 6 seats, to, a Trump victory. And in England, we also have, almost every kind of outcome is still possible. In other words, saving, I don't want to use that word. I want to say stopping the decline of democratic institutions is something that can be done at any time. You do, as my friend Masha Gessen likes to say, you do start to lose options. You lose ways of stopping it as it progresses. And I really think in a nonpartisan way, I think that the elections in November are one of those moments when we have a chance to stop something that and afterwards we will have fewer tools to stop it. We will lose some levers of control. And so I would say in each case, it is, you have the option of getting through it with just a little head cold, and the option of being intubated or dying, so in that sense, they're all like the coronavirus. In each case, the decline could be stopped, but in each case, I could sketch you scenarios where they could still go either way.
Fair enough. Just 2 more questions, and then I'm going to open it up. One is, as I reread the book for this discussion, the thing that struck me is, you also take the left to task. And I was wondering if you could say a bit about that, because, it does seem to me that, I'll just say for people like you and me, who've been pretty staunch critics of this administration, if there is this kind of sweeping rejection here of what the president has stood for, and we'll celebrate for a couple of days, have another party, and then we'll have to suit up, and we'll be back making similar arguments, just aimed at another bunch of former friends. So, but more seriously, could you just sketch out a bit of how you assess the responsibility of that class of thinkers, intellectuals, journalists, bloggers, writers, artists, to which I'd add students and professors, that that you describe at the beginning of the book on the right?
So the impulse towards authoritarianism or towards controlling speech, for example, is not a right-wing or left-wing impulse. I mean, you can find it on all sides of the political spectrum. You can find it in Islam. You can find it historically in Christianity. I mean, it's a, you know, the impulse to say, here's what you're allowed to say and here's what not, and, you know, here's what the rules are, and to impose that in an anti-democratic way is something that is repeated over and over again throughout human history. And so I do not think it is the, you know, just by being on the left or identifying as on the left that you are therefore exempt from it. And of course I don't think that, because I've written 3 very long books about, you know, a left-wing totalitarian society and what terrible damage it did to itself and to other people. So that's obviously the case. I mean, I do think, you know, it's pretty clear that there is, I mean, at the moment, it's in academia, it's in some cultural institutions, it's some newsrooms, it's in some publishing companies. There is an urge on the left to adopt a very simplistic ideas about race, about American history, about men and women, and then to seek to enforce those ideas through a series of speech codes, and to punish anybody who's seen to violate them. And this is now taken on the stupid name of cancel culture, which I wish we could abandon, because I'm not really sure what it means. And also I think it's something that both sides do. And it probably exists partly because of the internet, because Twitter and other forms of social media can now be used to, you know, to sort of create mobs. I mean, we don't have, you know, it's funny, we started with the quote about this not being the 1930s. One of the ways this isn't the 1930s is we don't have street movements, you know, politics doesn't really happen in the street, and therefore you don't need stormtroopers, right? But politics does happen on the internet. And now that phenomenon, that kind of mobs ganging up on people, happens online. And it happens on the right, and the right does it to people too, and don't believe it, you know, if they say otherwise. And it also happens on the left. And we've all seen myriad examples of this taking place, you know, in over the last couple of years, and some of them have gotten media attention, some have been over sensationalized. But I mean, there's, you know, that's definitely a phenomenon. And yes, I mean, as you know, when I find an appropriate moment and way to do it, I will write about that too. You know, it's funny for me because I live in Europe where, and mostly the last 6 months I've been in Poland, where we don't have this phenomenon. There isn't a left like that. And so it isn't a natural subject for me because I'm not surrounded by it like my friends in US academia are. But of course I will, you know, I think it's important to write about, and I'm sure you will too.
Yeah. Yeah. Not that I personally experienced it at SAIS, by the way.
Good.
And where Hopkins is, no, I think the Hopkins record on freedom of speech is one that we should all be proud of. I actually, let me just connect it with, this will be the last question, then I promise I'll go to the chat, the Q&A column. In July, you signed a letter that was published in Harpers on justice and open debate. And it was a really interesting letter because the signatories were basically center and left. It was, and it included people like Noam Chomsky, who you don't really think of in the same breath as Anne Applebaum. And there was a kerfuffle. There were all kinds of reactions. Just any thoughts about, you know, what you took away from that experience?
So the funny thing about that letter was that I signed a similar kind of letter, I think 2 years earlier, when Ian Baruma was fired from the New York Review of Books. And we don't have to litigate that now, why that happened. But it also happened as a result of a kind of social media fuss and so on. And I signed a letter together with all kinds of luminaries. I mean, literary critics and famous English professors and all kinds of people who write for the New York Review of Books and so on. And that letter got exactly no traction, and there was exactly no reaction. And it just disappeared into the into the cyberspace. And I honestly thought that the same thing was going to happen to the Harpers letter. I did not anticipate any reaction because my experience with signing letters is that no one cares. But so I was surprised by it. But as you I think hint, not entirely in a bad sense. I mean, one of the things that is clear about the letter, I mean, in retrospect, was that the significance of it, in fact, was the left-wing people, even the very left-wing people who signed it, because much of what was in it had been, you could have heard on the right or the center right for 10 years, people talking about free speech, or somebody, whatever, somebody's book had been not published because it wasn't, didn't fit the ideological rigor of the moment. And people have been complaining about that for a long time. And the significance of this letter was that now a big part, at least, of the sort of academic left, center-left establishment had signed up to it. And it was a pretty broad range of them, as you say, Noam Chomsky, Wynton Marsalis, and so I think it did represent a kind of sea, and the reason why it got attention was that there was a kind of sea change, like, oh, look, this has gone too far, people are beginning to react against it. And I think that was, I think it may, in retrospect, look like a turning point.
Yeah. Okay, I could keep on going, but that would be selfish, so I'm going to turn to Q&A. And again, I'd urge you to put questions in there, just make sure that they really are questions and that I can read them in a reasonable period of time. We've got several like multi-page letters here. Hans-Peter Storm, how should the EU handle Poland and Hungary?
That is a tough question, and the EU is agonizing about it. For those who don't know, the EU does have very strict rules about judicial independence and the rule of law, just to do a very shorthand version of it. And both Poland and Hungary are deemed to have broken these rules in recent years. And actually in Poland, it's quite an extreme problem, because there are Polish courts who have been appointed in such a politicized way that their verdicts are no longer recognized by some European courts. So and that's a big problem for the EU, because the EU is a kind of legal empire where everybody recognizes everybody else's laws, and if they can't be enforced in one country, then it creates all kinds of negative side effects. The trouble is that the EU doesn't really have a good, the EU was sort of founded on the assumption that there would be no democratic backsliding in its members. It wasn't founded with the idea that people could, would be kicked out for failure to observe the rules. And so at least not these kinds of rules. And the financial rules are a little bit different. So there isn't really a mechanism by which you can, punish, quote unquote, Hungary or Poland. And there certainly isn't a clear method for expelling them. Although this is one of the things I'm worried, one of the reasons I'm worried about is that the lack of a procedure to deal with this might lead to them being expelled, because it will be determined that there's no other way to deal with the problem. What I think they should do is, and this is in theory possible, is link more strictly EU funding to these kinds of violations. And this is a very controversial thing to say in Poland. And I understand why it's difficult for Polish politicians, even of the opposition, to say it, because it implies that but there needs to be some recognition of the benefits of the EU and what it is that Poland is getting from it, and how those benefits are connected to respect more generally for the values of the community. And that's the only way I can think of to do it. I mean, it is still my hope that even the current government in Poland will stop before it goes too far. That elements inside the ruling party will say, wait, do we really want to be kicked out? Do we really want to lose our funding? Do we really want to have politicized courts, which are ultimately going to be less just and less fair than independent courts? And so I'm still hoping that there will be some kind of internal process that will stop it before we get to that.
Eric Jaffe, a SAIS alum, actually a former student of mine, asks for your advice about dealing with how should we talk to, in his case, basically diehard Trump supporters. He's saying, on the one hand, it's obviously important to stand up for what you believe. On the other hand, if doing so will make the divide seemingly irreconcilable and, ultimately lead to something like a civil war, is it such a good idea? Do you have any thoughts about how do you conduct a dialogue, or can you conduct a dialogue with somebody who, for whatever reason, you think has really kind of gone over to the dark side?
So it's funny, I have actually done some even academic work on this question. There's a project that I started at the London School of Economics, which is being moved to Hopkins, and it would be there already if it weren't for the pandemic, which is called Areana, and I'm running it. I mean, really, the person who runs it is Peter Pomerantsev, my colleague. It's slightly more his project than mine, but we are the joint directors of it. And this is a project that has done various different kinds of things. We've tracked disinformation campaigns. We've tried to understand how disinformation works. But one of the other things we've done is look at deep polarization and how you get around it. One of the most important answers is that very often it's important to change the subject. So whatever is the so-called wedge issue, whatever is the polarizing whatever is the thing that you hate the most about whatever your Trump supporting friend believes, don't talk about it, and find another set of issues that you can talk about. We actually did a project, it's a long story, so I won't tell you all the details, in Ukraine, where we looked at difficult moments in Ukrainian history and looked at how, because there's a big division in Ukraine between sort of people who have a pro-Soviet view of Ukrainian history and people who have a nationalistic view of Ukrainian history. And we worked out that the way to get people to cooperate and to think of themselves as, as sort of members of the same country or the same community was to have them not talk about the most polarizing moments of the last 100 years and instead talk about other things. And I mean, it may be that the way to talk to your Trump supporting friend is to talk about some other traumatic thing that affected both of you. I don't know, the financial crisis. How should we deal with that? How would we have dealt with that? What are the best solutions to it? Or to talk about, I don't know, look for other issues that you both care about deeply. You might have slightly, but which don't run right through the middle of that ideological divide. So don't argue about, I don't know, whether it's abortion or whether it's your views of the Black Lives Matter movement or whether it's the Supreme Court, for God's sake. Don't talk about those things. Find other subjects, and it sounds a little cop-outy. But you can't, what you want to be able to have is real conversations about, the nature of our country and what it should do in the future and how we can work together and change things and make it better. And if that's the point of the conversation, then that's the best way around it. Don't talk about the weather, don't talk about, shopping. I don't mean that. I don't ignore it. Don't ignore politics. Talk about really hard, difficult political issues, but not the ones that divide you the most sharply.
Just building off that, at the end of the book, you reference Ignazio Silone, and there's, of course, who was a very famous Italian intellectual who, like a number of intellectuals, broke with communism. There's that The God That Failed. Essays by all kinds of people who were once part of the Communist Party and broke with it and basically ended up center left or center right. Do you think you're going to see that phenomenon here as well?
You mean former Trumpists saying they were wrong?
And I would say on both sides. I mean, because, I think you're right that there are sort of incipient kind of repressive movements on the left as well. Which are quite willing to justify things which are really sort of repressive. The question, we know for a fact that there were people who were sympathetic in the interwar period to either to fascism or to communism, who really did kind of rethink things and reemerge somewhere in the center, either on the left or the right-hand side of the center.
So of course this will happen. I mean, this is what politics is. People, this is why I use the metaphor of the party in my book, who do you invite to your New Year's Eve parties?
Yeah.
It changes, as new issues emerge, as, the the political coalitions shift and people see things in a new light. I mean, the world looked suddenly different after 9/11, and people, that was a moment when there were a lot of reforming of coalitions in America. The world might look different after the pandemic, and that might make people see things in a way they hadn't seen them before. And so, yes, I do expect the coalitions. I mean, we don't live in rigid societies where, I don't know, you either belong to the aristocracy or you don't belong to it, and that shapes your view of the world. I mean, I do believe that, I think one of the things that's happening right now is politics is reforming itself, and it's reforming itself around different issues. It became a little, the old right-left division that we all thought was so important 20 years ago matters much less now than divisions over other things. And so the parties and politics reform themselves. And yes, I do think people will break. I mean, in a way, that's kind of what the Harpers letter was on the left. There were a lot of people saying, "Wait, this is too much." Yeah. These incidents are becoming too numerous, and I can well imagine that on the other side too.
Yeah, I think that's right. Actually, it's one of the. It's one of those meta issues that I think, particularly at an institution like SAIS, we should be talking about and think about how politics itself is getting reshaped in many parts of the world, and it's going to have all kinds of consequences. Andres Pazman, an MIPP, asks about how do you combat support. I mean, I'm going to paraphrase this, so I hope you'll forgive me, Andres. How do you combat the really crazy stuff like QAnon?
QAnon is a tough one. It's funny. I'm in Europe right now, and over the last couple of days, I've had the experience of explaining to both Germans and Poles what QAnon is, and they look at me in total disbelief. And then I say something like 20% of Americans believe in it, and they just can't believe me. I mean, they think I'm making it up. And so
there was a French bestseller about how the airplanes actually didn't hit the Pentagon.
Yeah. I mean, we all think we're immune to conspiracy theory, but in fact, we're all exactly everybody is as susceptible as everybody else, and these cults emerge from time to time, and they just do. I mean, so I haven't written this yet, and I haven't done deep research on it, but I mean, one of my views about QAnon is that it is a product of the fact that we have an administration that we have, and in fact, we have a president who's now running an electoral campaign, which is predicated on making everyone believe a completely false picture of the world. That you have to, that the US is a great success, that we defeated the coronavirus, that everything is great and nothing bad happened in 2020. That's actually the president's election campaign, and it's being created in front of us, before our eyes. A absolutely false image of reality is being formed, and I think that and of course some people believe it and some people reject it, and that's a different question. But I think the fact that we are now led by people who have so much invested in, fake news is like we're long beyond that, but in absolutely false versions of reality, has loosened the grip that people have on reality. I think it's just not an accident that there is now this proliferation of conspiracy theory. We're led by a conspiracy theorist. That's what Trump is. He's good at starting them. He seems to believe in them. He sometimes advocates them, and sometimes tweets stuff about them. He seems to even approve of QAnon. And that just can't help but have an effect on the population. And I think that is, a big part of dealing with QAnon is, having him leave office and having someone grounded in reality running the country. It wouldn't even have to be Joe Biden, but anybody. So a lot of fighting it would be about bringing back some recognizable elements of reality into national politics. I think that would help a lot. There's a much deeper conversation also to have about the regulation of the internet. which is something I really believe is possible and I hope will be done sooner rather than later. And by that, I do not mean censorship. I don't mean just taking stuff down. That's a primitive way to do it. I mean rethinking what we want the internet to look like and how it's going to work for us as democratic societies, and not just be an instrument that makes money for people who live in Silicon Valley. And the decisions about how the algorithms work, how, what kinds of things spread and which kinds don't most quickly, needs to be needs to be connected to a democratic political conversation. And I think ultimately the answer will also lie in that.
Just one comment is that there's also education plays a large role in this. I mean,
although education is insufficient, it's not a sufficient answer.
I take that, but if I guess I believe in our university's motto that the truth will make you free, and if this is actually more, I think, at much earlier stages of education. If you're not teaching people to look for the truth and care about the truth, then you're going to be even more susceptible to craziness.
Yes, but be careful, because there are a lot of very clever and educated people who have come to believe crazy
things. For sure. Yeah, I even know a few. So a question from our colleague Vikram Nehru, which really builds, I think, on your answer to the last question, and that's he references The Social Dilemma on Netflix, which I haven't seen yet, but everybody is raving about, which is about the amplification and reinforcement of messages within the echo chambers, the profit-driven algorithms that are embedded in the business model of social media platforms. And he asked, how can and should governments deal with this, if at all? So that's really, maybe if you could just expand, in response to him, expand your last question a bit. When you talk, how can you imagine regulating the internet in ways which don't de facto turn into some sort of censorship?
So there's sort of two ways of answering that. I mean, one is, I was very struck a couple of years ago. I was at an event where somehow some version of this conversation was had. And I was talking afterwards to a woman who was quite a senior figure in a financial institution in London. And she said, some of this conversation reminds me of, the conversation about capital markets. So, everyone says the internet is so difficult to regulate. How could it be done? Well, look, what is in the world of international finance? There are billions of dollars flying around. There are people from every country in the world involved. There are hundreds of thousands of people trying to cheat every day. And there's a huge gain to be made potentially from cheating. Nevertheless, we managed to regulate it. So even something that seems, if you step back and think about it, impossible to regulate, it turned out to be possible. The second thing I would say is think about how we regulated the automobile industry. So when cars were first invented, there were no rules. I mean, you just drove them down the street behind the buggies, right? And then as there got to be more of them, we started to realize, well, then maybe we need stoplights, maybe we need, lines painted on the road. Maybe some people should have driver's licenses. And then as we got more sophisticated, maybe the cars themselves could be made safer. There could be airbags. In other words, as the car evolved, as it began to take on new forms, we began to think of ways to put it inside a regulatory system. And that, I think, is the way to think about the internet and disinformation as well, that just because we can't right at the second come up with a comprehensive answer to every piece of the problem doesn't mean that we can't have some solutions that would then evolve over time. I mean, particularly in Europe, and I think this is happening both because the Silicon Valley companies are Americans and therefore they're perceived by Europeans as foreign, and therefore they're less hampered in their desire to control them, but and also because Europe is it's a kind of regulatory superpower, and that's just how they think. But I know that certainly in Paris, certainly in Berlin, and certainly in Brussels, there are projects kicking around about how to do it. And they often involve things like, ombudsmen who look at algorithms to make, there is a conversation being had that I hope my project will be part of maybe we'll get some SAIS students to be part of, that will look at what is the public broadcasting equivalent of the internet? Can we reimagine what a public space would look like? Like if we were, because we know what the authoritarian internet looks like, right? I mean, China has done it. I mean, they've created this, vast system and they have millions of censors, right? So what is the alternative to that? If we were starting from scratch and with the now that we know that all political communication takes place online, or much that's important takes place online, how would we redesign the system so that better conversation is prioritized? In other words, civil conversation and conversation in which people are talking about reality and not fiction is prioritized over extremism and insanity, and that civil conversation, which by the way you can measure using artificial intelligence, is the thing that spreads rather than anger, fear, emotion, anxiety. And so these are just like small ideas I'm throwing out. I don't have a full-blown answer to it right now. It's one of the things I want to work on over the next couple of years. And I also do think that if the Democrats do win, I'm pretty sure it's going to be a topic on Capitol Hill. I mean, a final thing I would say, and this is maybe a shorter, easier way to think about some of that. I mean, it is certainly the case that there should be antitrust laws operating on the internet, and some of these companies are bad because they're too big and they're too influential. And the Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp conglomeration is clearly one of them. And having those things, some of those things begin to separate in itself would be good. And that's a fairly easy and straightforward legal change to bring about that I think we, as I said, depending on who wins the election, we might see.
Question from Tyler Bilbo, who's a second-year MA student. So do you think liberal democracy can coexist with the populist right-wing political movements that you feature in your book? So, for example, Law and Justice in Poland, but comparable movements in other places. In other words, are these really just, fundamentally incompatible, or can you kind of live with them and survive them?
It depends how they evolve. I mean, there's nothing, when Law and Justice was first elected, I was worried about them because I know them and I knew who was running it. But I didn't necessarily think that they would, harm democracy in Poland. I mean, I thought they would run the country and they would do things I disagreed with, but I didn't expect them to do necessarily to fundamentally seek to change the system. But they did. And so the problem with these movements isn't their, it's not, the problem isn't their ideas. The problem is that these are movements which define themselves as representing the true nation, right? We're the real Poles, or we're the real Americans, or we're the real, the true French. And therefore we have the right to stay in power indefinitely. And that authenticity that we have, that you don't have, gives us the right to whatever, nationalize the media, or, undermine the courts, or change the rules of the system so that it benefits us, so that we win the next election. And in some more extreme cases, change the rules in such a way that other parties can't win. I mean, I don't know, for example, right now, whether an opposition party can win a national election in Hungary. I mean, just can it actually be done? I don't know. I mean, the system is so tilted and so gerrymandered and so altered in Viktor Orban's favor that I'm not sure whether it can be done. Poland, I think, is still more open, but but
that actually raises.
So my point is, sorry, I should finish by saying that, if the, it depends. So you may, if the parties, if within themselves they find in themselves the desire to save the system, and if they make the decision to respect the rules, then I think, if they can evolve into normal parties, if they can become democratic parties, and this has happened in the past. You can think of sort of, particularly in post-colonial, new democracies, there's sometimes this one party that rules the country for a long time, and then eventually gives way. And if they can eventually come to think of themselves as normal parties and begin to compete in a normal way, then it's not impossible that some version of them could live on, as long as they think of themselves as having the right to change the rules to benefit themselves. And as long as they don't acknowledge their opponents as legitimate, then yes, they are always going to be a threat to democracy.
So the follow-on question to that, if I may, just to push that a little bit further, I don't get the sense that you think that these regimes are particularly durable, that they really have answers. And so my question there is, well, how do they come to an end? I mean, in large measure, what you describe are parties that are in some ways reactionary. Is that they're not trying to preserve the status quo. They see a status quo that's slipping away from them, and so they're fleeing into an imaginary past. And that's a pretty common phenomenon of societies that are, as you say, they're being buffeted by change, whether it's immigration or technology or changing economics, or just all the boulangeries disappearing in the French countryside. How does a regime like Orban's, which is a mature, if one may use that word, mature nationalist populist regime, how did they come to an end, do you think?
So, I mean, there are all kinds of, mostly bad ways that happens in history. I mean, they come to an end because they cheat in an election, as happened in Ukraine or in Belarus more recently, and there's a mass national movement. Or they come to an end because, there's an internal coup d'etat, or because the leader has stolen so much money that even the people around him can't stand it anymore. Or they last for many decades, like Putin in Russia. He simply wins by eliminating his opponents and by cheating. And they don't have real elections there anymore. So, except in some in some local elections. And so he stays in power. Sometimes they fall apart internally. The nature of these parties, they're often very unstable. I think ultimately the hope has to be that reality wins, that people say, wait, this fake picture that's being presented to me on TV isn't real. And I look out my window and something different is happening. And the contrast between the fake picture on TV and the real world is so strong that people cease to accept it. We saw that happen in 1989 with communist countries, and we've seen it happen in other places. And that, I hope that, reason returns and people understand, what's propaganda and what's not.
Yeah, well, that's a pretty powerful point. It's what we try to teach our children, is that in the long run, reality wins rather than you wish.
Right.
I deeply regret that we've come to the end. I'm just going to say, by way of conclusion, that in today's university, we talk about academics, we talk about professors, we don't talk about intellectuals, which is an older word and in some ways a more powerful one. And I think one of the things that's great about having you at SAIS and at Hopkins, it's a reminder of what an intellectual is supposed to do, which is to be a fearless, independent critic who's willing to annoy all kinds of people, particularly political people, and to do it with reason and argument and a passion for the truth, which is not a partisan passion. So thank you so much. It's a wonderful book. I wish we could have a book signing. We can't, but maybe we'll do it after coronavirus. And it's just wonderful to have you as a colleague. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate it. And I'm so happy to be affiliated with you and with SAIS. Thanks so much.
That's great. Okay. Thank you all.